government had not formally changed, but the balance of forces had. What was the content of that shift, and why did it allow the process to go on the offensive?
Yeah. So again, this actually is a good way of bringing what we were talking about with the first and the second question together. That the how a government seemingly on the surface can actually change in its nature, even though the same individuals stay there, and how determining how a government operates and functions can't simply be decided by its discourse, but actually by the social base that it rests on. So Chavez is elected in 1998, and of course, from very early on, he has a very progressive discourse. There's no denying that. And his main discourse at that time, although it will still be many years until he would be talking about anti-imperialism and 21st century socialism, but it was very much a progressive democratic discourse that focused or had it at its heart, at its center, the question of popular protagonism, of people's involvement in dealing with their sort of overcoming the sort of issues that they faced, and really the need to center human development as a way to change society. So in real simple terms, one of the slogans that Chavez would say is to explain his policy was that in order to get rid of poverty, you had to give power to the people. And that's what he sought to do. He sought to do that by changing the constitution, by enacting a number of decrees to do with land reform, with oil, and sought to sort of solidify links between the military and the poor by carrying out certain sort of projects where the military would go and work side by side with the communities, particularly after a very devastating mudslide in the first few years of his term. But the reality was that despite his discourse and intent, it was really the opposition at that point that had the political initiative. It had that in large part on the streets. The streets were contested, but the opposition was certainly at that time able to mobilize very large demonstrations, in some ways much larger than it has been in more recent years. It also, as was exposed through the April 2002 coup, continued to have weight in the military. And hence why you have, much of the military high command that participates in that April 2002 coup. And it continued to have control of the oil industry, in particular the state oil company PDVSA, and was able to use that to basically stop the flow of funds from the state oil company going through into the coffers of the state, into the national budget to be used for programs to eradicate poverty. The 2002 coup, defeat of the coup attempt, which sees a mass mobilization. And, it's interesting to compare it, the huge scale of the demonstrations that take place in April 2002 in comparison to the demonstrations we've seen more recently to the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro. Back then we're talking hundreds of thousands, if not into the millions of people that in some way or another mobilized around the country. Today we're talking, tens of thousands, if we want to be extremely generous, 100,000 at some of the biggest rallies. The scale is just incomparable. So you have that social base that comes out onto the streets that wins the confidence that it itself can regain and reimpose its president in power. We have the split in the military that enables Chavez to get rid of a whole bunch of high-ranking generals who are operating against the government in order to sort of depurify the military and at the very minimum have a military that would now stick to the constitutional order. I think it'd be exaggeration to say all of a sudden we had a revolutionary red army, but at least it was now an army that understood firstly that the majority of people, those who had voted for Chavez, would defend that government, and that any further attempt to try to overthrow it would require a very serious bloodbath. And so was willing to stick to the constitution. And then the oil lockout allowed it to get control of the oil industry and importantly, the revenue flow from that. So you have what is essentially the same government at the start of 2002 is a very different government by the end of the oil strike, even though the personnel is the same. And the difference is it now rests on a social power that's able to then explain the kind of political projects that happen over the next period of time that really fuel and make what up until then had largely just been ideas of the Chavez government.